Okay, welcome to the inaugural NIST Think Out podcast series. This is episode 7, brought to you by the NTU Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, which we just say NIST for short, at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. At NIST, we aim to contribute to the production of new knowledge and innovation with stronger ethical, social, economic, and cultural considerations. Today, we'll definitely be talking about those ethical considerations with our guest. We are a research excellence institute that addresses societal challenges through transdisciplinary team research. We seek to bring the interdisciplinary field of science, technology, and society to engage with various issues in our society, both at the local and global levels. In our Think Out podcast series, we seek to dwell deep into the personal journeys, research, and future progress of leading researchers and academics, industry experts, and societal influencers to better understand the motivations and prospects of their field of study and how it impacts society. In this episode, we are pleased to be joined by Professor Julian Savulescu. Professor Savulescu is the Chen Centennial Professor in Medical Ethics at the National University of Singapore, where he directs the Center for Biomedical Ethics. Professor Savulescu is also trained in medicine and neuroscience. Prior to coming to Singapore, Professor Savulescu held the position of the Uehiro Chair in Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford from 2002. He holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Bucharest. We are honored to have Professor Savulescu joining us for our podcast today. Firstly, welcome here.
Thanks very much.
To Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. It was a short drive for you up here. And I actually want to start with the last part of that introduction right there, an honorary doctorate from the University of Bucharest. Did you travel in order to accept that award?
Well, yeah, I did travel to receive it in person. It was a very nice ceremony. So my father's Romanian, and he escaped after the Second World War from Romania and eventually made his way through France and Europe and came to Australia and worked as a factory worker and lifting molten metal. And he was a barrister in Romania, and his brother was the engineer to the king. So he sort of had a significant decrement in his circumstances. And he unfortunately died in 1998, but I think he would have been extremely proud to see me receive that honorary doctorate. It was actually in the School of Law where I received it, where he received his degree. So, yeah, it was a very emotional ceremony. And since then, we've developed a relationship with Romania, and we run annual conferences. 1 year they're in Bucharest, 1 year they're in Oxford, and hopefully they'll be in Singapore now.
Mm. Thanks. See, that's exactly what I knew. There was a backstory there, and I wanted to try and work in to understand a little bit more about your background. Hearing there about your father, maybe about some of your influences in your upbringing, I think are really interesting, because I want to get a sense, especially for viewers who may not be familiar with your work. What's your background? How did you end up in bioethics? What kind of steps along the journey do you think kind of really illustrate that journey?
Yeah, well, I mentioned my father, and he was really a libertarian. He said, always choose freedom. So he left Romania with nothing, and had to work in a factory for many years, and eventually at a desk. And he died quite poor as a pensioner, but nonetheless, he said, always choose freedom. And my mother also, left school at the age of 14, was put to work in the woolen mills in Geelong, where I was born. And her family got special permission to take her out of school. Her mother had died and her father was an alcoholic. So she also had a very hard life, and they instilled in me this idea that, you should choose freedom, and that you should choose to make your own way in life. As it happened, I enjoyed thinking at school and studying, and so even in secondary school, I was interested in, at that point, religion and spiritual questions, but also philosophy. And when I went to university in 1982, I decided to study as a 5th subject in medicine. We could have an elective. philosophy. And at that point, I had the privilege of attending Peter Singer's lecture course. Peter Singer is arguably the world's most famous moral philosopher. I'm not sure how quickly this podcast will come out, but he's speaking in Singapore next week. And in 1979, he'd written this book, Practical Ethics, which in my view is the best book ever written on how to think and reason ethically. So it's gone through several editions. So there was a revolution in the 60s and 70s around thinking about ethics practically, not just about what we mean by the word good or right, but what we should do, whether we should go to war in Vietnam, whether we should eat animals. And this book was very significant. And for the first time in my life, I saw somebody able to argue about topics like poverty, the treatment of animals, euthanasia, abortion, infanticide, and argue in a way that I could follow the logic. And even when I disagreed, I could see along that path where exactly I disagreed. So I was extremely invigorated by this way of thinking, because at that point I thought ethics was about these big questions like abortion, infanticide, poverty, war. But actually it's about questions that we face every day. You know, what sort of car should I drive? Should I have an electric vehicle? How much money should I give to charity? These questions, all of us face. So I finished that year, and when I completed medicine, I still had this kind of acorn of interest in ethics. And while I was working as a doctor, I saw, young people severely injured and kept alive in terrible conditions. I saw shortages of resources and decisions being made about whether to spend money on this life or that life. And I decided to do a part-time master's degree in practical ethics with Peter Singer while I was working as a doctor. And then I enjoyed that so much, I decided to interrupt my specialist training to do a PhD, which was on end-of-life decision-making about how we make decisions about withdrawing or withholding medical treatment, which is sometimes called passive euthanasia, and the same arguments apply to active euthanasia. And then I got scholarships to go to Oxford as a postdoc, and I just drifted off really with opportunities. So it was really that introduction to rigorous analytical thinking that I received in 1982 that meant that I'm here today.
That's really amazing. I think so many people watching this podcast can completely relate to having that one class that, or that one encounter that kind of changes their trajectory. So thinking back upon that class that you were in with influential people must have been really interesting. Do you look back upon that experience now and see yourself potentially in that position for your students or your mentees?
Well, it's difficult for me to say, but I mean, a lot of students, for example, we've set up a very successful master's course in Oxford, and the students have been, hugely positive and seem to be inspired, many of them going on to do PhDs, and we have people from Google or Glaxo or people who are in politics in the US, and they've seemed to have got the enthusiasm and inspiration that I had, which is my goal. It's not to teach a particular creed. We're going to set up a similar master's here in Singapore, and that is aimed at giving everyone the opportunity of deepening their thinking skills about how to make decisions about right and wrong, good and bad, which is what ethics is about. Mm-hmm. And there's a common mistake that people make, that they think that these are questions that experts should answer, or that they're scientific questions. You heard in the pandemic this phrase constantly, at least you heard it in Australia, we're just following the science. Science can never tell you what you should do. It can tell you how to do it. It can tell you facts about the world or about people, but it can't tell you what's right or wrong or good or bad. That's the domain of ethics. And what we do is try to help people to think more deeply for themselves about those issues, because in the end, you're going to have to decide, are you going to hire a helper? Are you going to support capital punishment? Are you going to, what job are you going to take? There's one of my colleagues, Will McCaskill, was a student in Oxford, has a book called 80,000 Hours. You spend 80,000 hours at work. Should you be thinking about how much good you can do in that 80,000 hours? What sort of career should you choose? So, I think the students have got that in enthusiasm that I had, and I take that as a success.
Yeah, and then kind of shifting towards the people who are sort of on the receiving end of perhaps your recommendations, or maybe may find your research useful. We're talking about practicing doctors, for example. When you look back upon yourself as a practicing doctor in that situation, without all of your education yet in ethics and all of the the thinking and thought leadership you've done, when you look back upon yourself, do you think that at that time, what you were perhaps seeking was recommendations from ethicists, or were you seeking to just have the tools to better think through things and make decisions, like you said, for yourself?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think medicine proceeds on an assumption that doctor knows best, and there still is a lot of paternalism. And I think many doctors, when I started out my career, because I was a very successful sort of medical student, I won all the prizes and had a stellar career ahead of me, and people were looking to me for guidance, and people said to me, what we hate about ethicists is they say on the one hand this, on the other hand that. And so I used to give quite clear sort of action guiding. I think this is the right thing to do. This is what you should be doing. And as I've got older, I've realised that actually there is a black and white zone in ethics. There are right and wrong, to questions, but there's also a big grey zone where you have to make your own decision about what you think is right. And I've become more of, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. So I do think I've moved more away from prescription to enabling people to identify ethical issues for themselves and give them the concepts, the theories, the principles, the ways of thinking for them to arrive at the decision for themselves. To give you a trite example, I've become a real Singaporean, and I've bought a car. I've gone through the pain of the COE, and also just got my license after sitting the BTT. I had to sit it twice for some bizarre reason. And what struck me about Singapore is how low the speed limit is. The maximum here is 90. And is that right? Does Singapore have the right speed limit? In the UK, I'm used to driving at 130. In Germany, I can drive at any speed I want on the Autobahn. So why 90? Well, the speed limit that is the right speed limit is a balance of different factors. The lower the speed limit, the safer it is. The lower the speed limit, the less the carbon emissions. The higher the speed limit, the more the pleasure, the more freedom, more economic efficiency. So how you balance those different factors, there isn't a formula to that. I can't tell you that 90 is right or 130 is right. It's really, and this is where ethics is in the grey zone. So many decisions are like that about whether someone should live or die. For example, my mother, this is a kind of very typical dilemma that many Singaporeans will face, developed dementia at the end of her life, and she was fiercely independent. She made her way from nothing. And always said, if I'm ever dependent on other people, don't keep me alive. Now, when she got dementia, she became very dependent and eventually needed to have full-time care, but was very happy and could still recognise me and my wife and my children. And the doctors asked me, do you want to give her a flu vaccination this year? And flu used to be called the old man's friend, that it gave people at the end of their life a way of passing. But I decided to give it to her and to try to keep her alive, even though that may not have been what she wanted, because I made a decision that her life was sufficiently happy. Now, there's a big debate about whether we should give weight to people's previous wishes before they were in that state, or their autonomy, or whether we should give weight to their happiness. So that isn't a question that I know, for example, a colleague of mine, a former colleague, her husband developed dementia, and he was, like my mother, fiercely opposed to being dependent and losing his faculties, and she took him to Dignitas in Switzerland, where he had assisted dying, and he was killed. So, these are questions that all of us will face. How long do we keep our loved ones alive? In what condition? Where do we keep them at home? Do we put them into care? these are all big decisions, and they require us to think about them. I wish there was a God that I could just ask, so what should I do with my mother? Or, but if there is, I don't have a sort of line to him or her, and I have to make my own decisions. And I find them extremely difficult. But I found ethics and what I learnt, at university and through my life, extremely valuable on a day-to-day basis. Just deciding. For example, I have a beautiful 7-month-old boy.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where do I send him to preschool? When do I send him to preschool? Right? Which preschool do I choose? Some have a higher student to teacher ratio. Some cost more money. Some have more outdoor facilities. Some have the opportunities for music. Some are closer, more local community. Some you learn better Mandarin. So how do you balance all of those factors? And I think ethics is about trying to think through those dilemmas a little bit more deeply.
Really interesting, and I can completely relate to the preschool debate. Believe me, some centers don't even have windows. You talk about the outdoor spaces. Yeah. So how do you balance these factors? So actually, thinking about this balance and sort of the flux of the natural world and how different factors come to weigh upon your decision. So thinking about practical ethics. Obviously, you're well known for this, for founding a center at the University of Oxford. If you could talk now about, first of all, there's the basic question, especially for viewers who aren't familiar with it, which is what is practical ethics. But I'm also curious as to, in 2002 when you started this center, what did you think practical ethics was? And over the past couple of decades, what has changed in this field or changed in your conceptualization of what it is and what it can do for the world?
Yeah, so practical ethics is being able to, first of all, identify what is an ethical issue and what's a scientific or empirical issue, so drawing that distinction. So, when you're deciding in medicine, whether to keep somebody alive, the empirical questions will be, what's the probability, what means can you use to keep them alive? But the question of whether you should keep them alive depends on values. So ethics is about values and identifying when there are value judgments at play. I mentioned the example of the speed limit, and what I referred to were values. So science and medicine tells us the facts, but we need to be able to identify what values do we to act. We need a value, and then we need a mechanism of achieving that value. And ethics is about identifying when there are value questions at stake. And then it's about how do we weigh different values. So in the pandemic, which we're still in sort of our consciousness, one conflict of values was between freedom and public health. Another value is how do we value different people's lives? How do we value young lives versus older lives? The decision to roll out the vaccine in the UK in, tiered age groups, 90 to 100 first, then 80 to 90, then 70 to 80 meant that you saved the most lives, but actually more younger people, relatively younger people died in their 60s or 70s because they waited longer for the vaccine. So you said that, our value is that all lives will be equally valued regardless of the age or how long that person would live or their quality of life. Now that's contestable. Yeah. Some countries propose just having a cut-off at, say, 60, where everyone then gets equal access. So that's a different ethical position. So practical ethics is about, first of all, being able to identify when those value judgments are at play, and then deciding how do we weigh freedom versus public health or freedom versus well-being. In The Brothers Karamazov, there's a famous novel by Dostoevsky, famous discussion between Ivan, one of the brothers, and the devil, where the devil said, I can give humans happiness, but Ivan says, freedom is more important. So this debate between how we weigh happiness versus freedom is, as old as human society, and there are different ways of thinking through that. What I think has changed is that, first of all, in the mainstream, there has been a move to what's called postmodernism, which is, there aren't answers to these questions. It's in the eye of the beholder. Ethics is in the eye of the beholder. Mm-hmm. Your gender is what you believe it is. Everything is constructed either by society or by yourself. There isn't an objective ethical reality. And I think that view is wrong. I think there are elements of truth to it. So if you take the disability debate, so disability, things like paraplegia or blindness or deafness, until say 2000, these were viewed as medical conditions where you identified an individual as suffering from a disability when they had an inability to function below a certain level. So if you were in the bottom, say 2% of the population with intelligence, you had intellectual disability, and we needed to cure you, or we needed to treat in some way that problem with your function. There's been a swing starting in the sort of 80s and 90s, but has gained more momentum to say, no, disability is not a kind of objective medical fact. It's socially constructed. The reason why people with disability are disadvantaged is because of the way society is organised. If we had more wheelchair ramps and more access, and so people with paraplegia would have lives that were equally good as people that don't have those conditions. So this is the social construction argument. So this you'll see in gender, in many other areas. And this has been a kind of dominant move away from saying, no, there is something objectively bad with being deaf or with being blind or paralysed. I've taken a middle view that has said that a disability is some state of your body or your biology or your psychology that tends to reduce your well-being in a given social or environmental circumstance. So it's true that you can make people's lives worse if the deaf people aren't given the opportunity to interact through sign language. So I've argued that all children should learn sign language at school. This would facilitate communication with people who are deaf and the deaf community, and also give people a unique form of communication. But deafness is still going to represent an obstacle because you can't hear auditory warnings. You can't hear cars or animals. You can't hear music. You can't correct for all of the disadvantages associated with deafness socially. So I think there's some truth to the social constructivist, the social model, but there's also some objective features. Now, these debates have real consequences. So the deaf community has said, we're not disabled in any intrinsic way. We're simply disadvantaged by the way you treat us, and we have a unique culture, so we want to have deaf children like ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so some couples have decided with genetic forms of deafness to deliberately use IVF and genetic selection to have a deaf child. Or they have a child who's born deaf and the child could have a cochlear implant and they refuse to have the cochlear implant. So they're deliberately deciding to have children with deafness because they believe this social model. So, we have to, when a parent refuses to have a cochlear implant, the doctor has to say, well, is this just another choice like which preschool to send the child to? Or is this like a parent of a Jehovah's Witness parent who, for the religious reasons refuses blood transfusions and refuses a life-saving blood transfusion for their child? And in those cases, the doctor will take the parents to court and will have a court authorisation to give the blood transfusion. So is the cochlear implant, like a choice we allow parents to make, or is it a choice like the blood transfusion? So we have to decide, are their arguments correct or not? So, unfortunately, we're going to have to face these decisions and make a choice because the lives of future generations are affected. Mm-hmm. So one other area where I think ethics has changed over the last 20 years is that I've mentioned this subjectivism, this social construction, these constructionist approaches to ethics that say that ethics is in the eye of the beholder. Another manifestation of that is sometimes called relativism, that ethics is just relative to culture. So, what's right in Singapore is not necessarily right in another country, and we can't make decisions cross-culturally. We have to have, respect for different cultures. Now, nobody says that the Nazis were just a different culture and we need to respect their set of values. So there clearly are, and the whole of human rights is a move away from this cultural relativism or this ethical relativism. But I think we haven't found a way of negotiating, okay, what is within the realms of a particular culture, what's in the grey zone and what's in the black and white. Yeah. And to sort of to identify that black and white, I think we need objective ethics. We need something that isn't just saying, well, it just depends on what. Now, I think there are many questions that are culturally relative. So you have capital punishment in Singapore. I think that's a question that even John Stuart Mill, famous defender of liberalism, defended capital punishment. It's a difficult question that countries can, I think, legitimately vary on. I don't think that there's, just an obvious answer. It will depend on the circumstances, the particular policy, the particular country. But then there will be issues like slavery, where we don't think that, it depends on whether a particular, community endorses slavery. And then there'll be questions of exploitation of workers, so, at what level of wage or conditions is it sufficient? Singapore will have different conditions to other countries, and is that exploitation, or is that, offering freedom of movement and freedom of work and the opportunity to better yourself? Mm-hmm. So, I think there is a grey zone. So, for example, in the creating deaf children, mm-hmm. I think it's wrong to deliberately select a deaf embryo rather than a hearing embryo. But I think parents should be allowed to do that, because that's not harming that child. So if you choose one embryo from 10 embryos that you've genetically tested and it's deaf, and let's say, call that embryo Danny, and you pick that embryo rather than another one that was hearing, say Harry, Danny can't complain and say later, oh, you did the wrong thing. You selected Danny rather than Harry, because he wouldn't exist. So this is a puzzling feature of reproduction, that selection determines who comes into existence. And in that way, it's a different question to taking Danny and saying, we're not going to give you a cochlear implant, because in that case, he can be hearing or deaf. He can have the option. In that case, he can complain he's been harmed by being denied the cochlear implant. So I don't think we should deafen children. I don't think we should deny them cochlear implants. But I think people should be legally permitted to use genetic selection to select children that are deaf, even though I personally think that's wrong. Now, that's a complicated position. It just shows you how you can have different positions on these debates. Some people say there's deaf children, for example, in the UK, it's illegal, and I'm sure it's illegal in Singapore, to genetically select a deaf child. It's illegal. In the US, it's anything goes, whatever you want. Indeed, in some cases, they've allowed parents to refuse cochlear implants. So extremely libertarian. So there are different ethical positions, and I think we have to find where each of us sits within those.
Yeah, really interesting. My next question was actually going to talk about practical ethics and how, in my layperson, frankly, reading of the field and what it is you try to do, it seems to, in terms of ethical, fields and ways that you can study ethics, it seems to invite controversy because you deal with difficult topics. And you talked about, you just briefly touched on probably, I think, maybe what you would say is your best, or what you're most well known for, which is this issue of genetic enhancement, perhaps, in selecting. The internet is full of videos that our listeners and readers can go and watch of you having endless debates with people who are fighting you on this, and I'm not in a position to do that. So what I thought would be a bit more interesting was to actually, feel free to talk about your views on this and how it's been controversial over time, but I'm curious as to what your advice would be to other scholars who, even if they're not ethicists, or even leaders in the medical field. What is your advice to people who are dealing with controversy, either in their research or in their profession, specifically medical stuff, because this has characterized a lot of your existence, right? You know?
Yeah, I mean, if I had my chance to wind back, I mean, I've tried to present provocative arguments, not because I'm on a mission, I'm not a missionary, to convert people. It's to provoke them to think for themselves. I mean, I don't care what personally, about doping in sport, but, I've given arguments in favour of, physiological doping. But my advice to somebody starting out is, when engaged, always be respectful. So when you're engaged in a controversy with an opponent or another group, people can tolerate disagreement. What they can't tolerate is disrespect, if they perceive they're being disrespected, if their view is being disrespected. So I think you have to be respectful of the other side. So when I was the editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics, all this internet stuff just blew up. And we had an article which we published, which I disagreed with again personally, but passed peer review, which was defending infanticide. And this became front page news. And really, kind of ruined the academic lives of the people who wrote the article. Whereas, Peter Singer wrote a book called Should the Baby Live, which was about infanticide in the 80s, and that, nobody batted an eyelid. So until about 2000, people debated these things, and, there were disagreements, in the classroom, but there weren't these kind of these internet lynch mobs that were, and there weren't institutions responding to their public image being called into question, and then, sacking or suspending or, punishing academics for articulating controversial views. So what we did with the Journal of Medical Ethics from that point was, first of all, we made sure we didn't unnecessarily inflame people. So when writing a piece, if you don't want to get a lot of unnecessary heat, make the abstract and the title as bland as possible. I call this process blandification. So if you want to get a lot of attention, make a really provocative title and a really provocative abstract, because that's all people will read. But if you don't want that, if you want more kind of measured debate, then tone down the language. The other thing to do is to invite somebody from the other side to give an opposing view. So do things in pairs. So what people don't like is not seeing their view or the view they want to hear represented aired. So we often would run companion pieces or commentaries, or if I'm going to run something on a particularly controversial topic like, say, infanticide, I would have a for and against. So, people can find where they situate themselves within the debate. So I think those are the two, those are the sort of main tools I use. But I think today we actually live in a kind of Orwellian 1984, where it's not the government that is suppressing freedom of speech, it's the internet and private institutions. So what happens now is someone will be prosecuted by the internet posse or lynch mob, and then their institution will say, our stakeholders, our students, our donors, this isn't good for business. We better suspend this person, or we better sack them. So it's not the government, actually. So now I'm very conscious about what I say or what I will argue for in a way that I wasn't 20 years ago, because I know I could lose my job. And in many ways, Singapore is freer now than, say, the United States or Europe, because as far as I can see, there's a sort of willingness to listen to arguments and ideas, and there isn't this ideology that, we now know the objective truth, and we're going to sort of, anyone who questions that is a sort of right-wing neocon that deserves to be burned at the stake and is a supporter of Donald Trump. So I think there is a problem with academia and freedom of speech now globally. And, it's causing people to suppress, arguments for controversial issues, say transgender. Peter Singer actually founded a journal called the Journal of Controversial Ideas with Jeff McMahon and Francesca Minerva to enable people to publish articles on topics like gender and those sorts of topics. So, it is, even though there are strategies, it's much more difficult now to engage in controversial ideas.
You've mentioned a couple of things. Now, this wasn't on my list of questions, but you mentioned a couple of things that talk about the effect of technology on the field of ethics. For example, everyone now believes that, everyone's own answer to a question is just their own. It's a personal choice, things. And I wonder if that's related to, that there's the same phenomenon of social media. People have their own information bubbles, their own reality that they live in. They can select their facts that they believe are true. I've heard people, and I can't remember who, discuss this as being the sort of the degradation of consensus reality that modern technology has brought, that we don't have a shared mental model of the world anymore that people can congeal around to talk about these deep issues, for example, of ethics. And now you're also kind of talking about, the internet posse, the mobs, maybe perhaps cancel culture, is how some people think of it. So what do you, there's obviously a right and wrong and a gray zone here, but when you think about the effect of technology now on the effect, on ethics going forward, you've talked a lot about the last 20 years, and you look forward now 20 years with all this new technology coming online. How do you see this playing out, or how, I know that's an impossible question, how do you at least hope that it plays out?
Okay, so I've written a book in 2012, and in 2008 I first floated this idea with Tom Douglas and Ingemar Persson of moral enhancement and the need for moral enhancement. We also talked about moral bioenhancement. And to sort of briefly rehearse the idea that we put in 2012 is that if you look at technological development, it's been this massive exponential curve following Moore's law. Now, people talk about the singularity, but we have ChatGPT, large language models. We have, whole genome sequencing for less than, $1,500. It just gets faster and faster and more powerful. It's incredible and so in last century, in the middle of the century, only a handful of people could destroy the world with technology. People in Russia, China, and the US, presidents and premiers. And now, tens of thousands of people, probably hundreds of thousands of people, can destroy the world with biological weapons. You can make them very cheaply and easily with stuff you can buy on the internet. You don't need to have your finger on the nuclear button, although that's still a huge risk. And we saw that with COVID. COVID was actually an incredibly puny pandemic. It killed mainly older people who, through most of human history, you wouldn't have known that there was a COVID pandemic because people wouldn't have lived that long to die. It didn't affect young people. And if the mortality had been inverse, if it had been a 14% mortality of 10-year-olds instead of a 14% mortality of 85-year-olds, we would have collapsed. So we couldn't deal with something that, a virulent form of influenza that killed young people, with a high mortality, or even worse, smallpox. So technology has massively increased, and it's with the increasing power of, what we can do, we can also do enormous bad. And we've just seen the tip of the iceberg with COVID. There's questions about whether it's a lab leak. It doesn't matter. There are labs that could leak this kind of stuff, and people could deliberately create it. That, I think, is one of the biggest existential questions we face. So we have this enormous technological power that's just going up and up and up. And, over the last 10,000 years, societies have gradually become more and more complex, from simple farming to, towns and cities, and now we live in a globalized world, and that creates problems like climate change, where we need global collective action solutions, or the situation in the Ukraine, or the kind of balance of power, or the alleviation of poverty. All of these require global solutions, not individual solutions. So we've got technology going up like this, we've got society going into a globalized state like this, and now we've got human beings. Let's look at them. So they emerged about 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, on the African savannah and developed a moral psychology to enable them to cooperate in small groups of 150 to survive. So that people are very good at helping each other and working together in small groups. And our morality, all the moralities that every culture has have prescription against harming, against killing, against hurting members of the group. They don't have strong requirements to aid other people, because through most of that 200,000 years you couldn't do much except hunt an animal. And they don't certainly set us up for cooperation for global collective action problems where our contribution makes no difference. So we don't have the moral psychology to deal with global collective action problems or to deal with technology with massive harms. We don't see them. We don't see risks. We're set up to deal with single individuals. So people are more prepared to help one individual than two. Then they're more prepared to help two than four. And so we just lack the moral psychology. So this is a long-winded answer to, I'm very pessimistic about the future, because I don't think that we are psychologically and particularly morally set up to deal with a technology that is on just an exponential escalator. So what I think we need to deal with things like ChatGPT or to deal with bioweapons is education in schools. We also probably need some forms of biological enhancement, but more importantly, we need to really completely rethink our education. It's like dealing with 20th century problems. And it doesn't teach ethics. It doesn't teach people. You mentioned very perceptively this islandization of moral communities. Like we now find our little group on the internet and we have fed the facts that suit that group. We reinforce our values. We're not encouraged to engage in a dialogue. So how are you going to do that? Well, that has to be through education of children. And it has to be a restructuring of society. So to deal with the technology that we are developing and the world that we're creating through the internet and social media, so we actually need to completely rethink education, and in particular, our moral education. It's not about teaching people, you should be, you should believe in Christian God, or you should believe in Allah, or but teaching them to engage in dialogue, to be empathetic with other people, to be able to think through ethical issues. So to create a kind of secular moral education that enables people to live with this power. So, I've given this analogy, we're like 3-year-old children with a machine gun now. And unfortunately, we wrote that in 2008 and 2012, and at the turn of the century, Francis Fukuyama was saying, with the end of history, Berlin Wall has fallen, democracy has shown itself to be the sort of dominant, the solution to sort of political arrangements. Nothing could be further from the truth. If we look at Russia, and the Ukraine now, and the relations between the US and Russia, and the relations between the US and China, nothing could be further from the truth of the success of democracy and our ability to sort of live with each other. So, I think we're at the very beginning rather than at the end of history. Well, it could be the end of history because we destroy ourselves this century. And, very credible thinkers, like Martin Rees or Richard Posner or Nick Bostrom have put the probability of us destroying ourselves this century at 50%. Through nuclear weapons, through biological weapons, or biological misadventure, artificial intelligence, perhaps climate change, maybe nanotechnology. And we now are the masters of our destiny. And unfortunately, we're not very competent masters. Mm-hmm. So, ethics is actually more important than it ever was. If you got it wrong before, your community might disappear. You get it wrong now, the whole world will disappear. Mm-hmm. So, I'm very pessimistic. I just, hope I get a chance to. I've got young children now, and I really am sort of pessimistic. But I think it's a feature of getting old that you get pessimistic and predict the end of the world.
So earlier we talked about, having controversial views sometimes and dealing with controversy as an academic. Now, we've briefly touched on COVID, when that used to be a thing. It feels like it was so long ago now. Obviously, at that time, I'm sure ethicists, bioethicists like yourself were in great demand to talk about topics like mandatory vaccination or restricting people's movement, and autonomy. But now there comes the process of looking back upon those decisions. We now look back and we see COVID perhaps as a kind of a stress test of many kind of ethical principles or regulatory systems that we had in place. And I'm sure that you yourself have had to struggle with this as well, looking back upon your opinions that maybe you had at the time or the decisions that were made. And now that you have complete information, you may feel differently about it. And it can be hard to remember that perhaps when you had those views in that 2020 podcast that you did or that 2021, you had those views because you didn't have the complete information that you have now. And I'm sure there's a lot of ethicists or professionals in the medical field who are struggling with these questions right now. How do you sort of deal with this process of avoiding kind of hindsight bias in talking about things that have happened in the past and or looking at past decisions that have been made by policymakers or even yourself? And what advice do you have for people who are struggling with these questions right now?
Yeah, well, actually, I actually don't regret any of I think my sort of views on COVID turned out to be correct.
I didn't mean to say you regretted it.
No, but I think it's a very good question. And I think, if I look back, the things that I think we should be doing are separating the value considerations from the factual considerations, because what we can do as ethicists is deal with the value considerations, and then you have to plug in what the facts are. Now with COVID, the facts, the information changed, the understanding changed, and so policies changed. I think one of the problems that people have, both in the public and in politics, is that they see that change is a negative thing, and it's not. First of all, you can decide to realign your values, and secondly, you get more information, and it means that what you did think was right was actually wrong. And so to take mandatory vaccination or coercion generally in the pandemic, I wrote a paper in May 2020 that set out the conditions for when mandatory vaccination would be justified, that had 4 factors, and this applies to any form of coercion. 4 factors: severity of the problem, gravity of the problem, safety and effectiveness of the intervention. Third factor is then the comparative advantage of coercion over non-coercive measures, so how much better is it to coerce? And then, is the level of coercion, the costs, are they proportionate to the benefits that you're getting out of this policy, right? So you have to go through each of these 4 steps to justify mandatory vaccination. And at that point, I predicted that I didn't think that mandatory vaccination for COVID would be justified, because I didn't think the vaccines were going to be effective enough to justify widespread, and also there would be inevitably side effects, because these are completely new platform vaccines. But that didn't matter, because you just have to plug in the facts into that algorithm, actually, I call it algorithmic bioethics, to decide whether you think that the vaccination is mandatory or not, given the facts that you have at the time. So I think the way that ethicists can get over the benefits of hindsight is to stick to what they do, and that is dealing with values. And so in this case, I was identifying 4 relevant values and then creating an algorithm for the 4 of them, and not getting heavily involved, in my view, in the facts. I think the facts are a scientific issue, and then when you have those, you can then form a policy. And I also in that work, identified the possibility of selective forms of coercion, so selective mandates. So, for example, Greece and Italy had mandatory vaccination for people over a certain age, because these are individuals who would benefit most from the vaccines. The risks would weigh less heavily for them, and they were the most likely to put pressure on the health system. So I think selective mandatory vaccination for older people was ethically justified, because that the last two steps of that algorithm were better satisfied in the older populations. So here's a way in which we can identify a policy that is more fine-grained once we understand the facts about the vaccine and the populations that it affects. So I think, hindsight criticism is a very dangerous thing. And, I think that ethicists, in my kind of genre, should stick to the sort of the values. Now, a lot of people are advocates, and for them, if you want to make the world a better place, you have to care a lot about the facts too, and you have to then advocate particular policies, like you should give to famine relief, or you should give to should alleviate poverty. I'm a kind of Socratic ethicist that thinks that ethics is about getting people to think for themselves. But people like Peter Singer are sort of missionaries who also want to make the world a better place. And there you have to get your hands dirty with the facts a lot more.
Going forward, I'm curious as to how you are approaching these issues of the use of machinery, basically to make decisions, medical decisions. There's a lot of aspects to this, whether the humans are in the loop or not. But what do you think are some of the critical questions that need to be answered going forward when we think about technology or machines gaining more autonomy, which is probably inevitable, right?
Yeah. Look, machines are just tools. AI is just a tool. They don't make decisions. We make decisions, and what matters are the values we put into them. So I don't have no problem with algorithmic decision making. I think it'll be a great advance. What matters, though, are the values that we put in, and also that we evaluate the performance according to our values. That we don't give up to what I call machine paternalism, where the machine, we let the machine decide without identifying what the values are that it's either aiming to maximize or that it performs against. So to take driverless cars, there may be black box algorithms there that determine their behavior, but we need to decide whether the distribution of harm and benefit that results from that is ethically justifiable. So we require ethics. I've been writing, on ChatGPT, as everyone has. Like in COVID, it was like everyone was writing on COVID, and now everyone's writing on ChatGPT. And I've written. I managed to produce a paper in 45 minutes by giving ChatGPT a title: mandatory vaccination, mandatory moral bioenhancement, the vaccination analogy. I wrote an abstract. I wrote 5 sections. I wrote the titles of 5 sections in the first line. So all that took me, 15, 20 minutes. And it came out with a paper. And I presented this paper at a conference and said to people, do you think this paper is publishable? And half of them said, yes, I think it is publishable. Now, I did correct a couple of tiny mistakes. It doesn't have references. And I did have to replace or put in a section it didn't fill in. But this was ChatGPT 3. Right, not ChatGPT 4 or other language models. So I think the challenge with something like that sort of machine is that we need to co-create with it. So what I did there was, it didn't come up with any new ideas. It simply filled in the arguments filled in the text of the main arguments that I presented it with. But I think the challenge is to ensure that we retain our humanity, which is. So what is humanity? Well, one of it is ethics, deciding whether the outcome is ethical or not. So for example, with ChatGPT and writing papers, have I added to the value of that product sufficiently to warrant praise? So if I was to write a grant using ChatGPT, how much of it is ChatGPT? How much of it is me? Is that sufficient? That's an ethical question. The other one is, about our creativity and, our ability as humans to develop our own talents and abilities. So in another example, we recently wrote up this paper. We asked ChatGPT to write a paper based on an abstract of some papers that we'd already written and compared them. It actually came up with new connection of ideas that was valuable. Now, if we were actually to publish that, we would have to credit ChatGPT, but it enables us to jump up the ladder of knowledge and progress more quickly. And as long as we are sufficiently still contributing, sufficiently crediting. I think this model of co-creation could enable us to accelerate our productivity as the computer has or as the internet has.
I mean, technology always accelerates human knowledge.
So I think there are great upsides
Yeah.
to these machines and algorithms and ChatGPT. And I think it's within the possibility that we can use them to enhance our humanity. But it's also possible they'll dehumanize us and alienate us or destroy us. So I think the risks are real. The benefits are great, but the risks are very significant as well and real. And I think in general, the problem is that our world in the West is set up to the market decides. So, Google, Apple, Facebook, they sell products to make money for their shareholders. They're not interested in your well-being or, the future of the planet, really. And there aren't great incentives at the moment for them to care about those values. So their value is capital. So unfortunately, the set of incentives for the development of these technologies is flawed. Now, can we create an ethical version of capitalism? Can we create better incentives for companies to care about the well-being or the autonomy of their users? I don't know. It seems like there is a massive power structure there that is going to be difficult to change.
Well, the future is
open.
Yeah, it's open. It's like you said. It's up to us to shape it, and let's hope that works out good for humanity.
I hope my little 7-month-old has a nice future.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that brings us to the end of our podcast episode with renowned expert, of course, Professor Julian Savulescu, and the Chen Su Lan, Centennial Professor in Medical Ethics at NUS. We hope you enjoyed our session today, and we look forward to bringing you many more informative and relevant discussions in future episodes. Until next time, stay safe and thank you.